What are some declassified government documents that are surprisingly terrifying? When the Space Shuttle Challenger was destroyed, it was reported that all 7 astronauts were killed instantly. It was revealed decades later that some, if not all of the astronauts survived the initial explosion, as the cockpit cabin had enough protection to not be breached. For 2 minutes and 45 seconds, they were awake and aware as they plummeted toward the Atlantic Ocean. Understandably, NASA knew that the news of their terrifying death would have crippled the space program even more than it already was. We looked at this in flight school and pretty much, there's evidence to support that the crew was still running their procedures, even after it was obvious shit hit the fan. They didn't die accepting their fate, they died astronauts. That's something to be admired. The same happened with Columbia. The crew were working the systems to try to troubleshoot and recover even as the space shuttle was burning up and breaking apart around them. The crew cabin was the last piece to break apart. The plan after 9/11 to make figurines that look like Osama bin Laden and give them to kids in South Asia. After it's left in the sun for a certain amount of time, its face would peel off to reveal a demon-like visage with red skin, green eyes, and black markings. Basically a demon. The objective was to scare kids and their parents, so bin Laden and Al-Qaeda would lose support. You should watch The Holy Mountain. In it they talk about knowing they will have to go to war with a country in 15 years. They make comic books and toys with a villain that looks like that other race. They also make ipecac type medicine the same color as the skin of that race. All sorts of things to prepare kids to hate a particular races by the time they are of military age and the war is fought. That's one of the weirdest and surreal films I've seen. The bit when 2 people are making out in the back of a car and it cuts to a goldfish out of water struggling to breathe made me laugh every time. My previous answer to another post, https://www.thiblackvault.com/ not sure if this has been mentioned or not. I'm not scrolling through a million replies. The site is run by a guy named John Greenwald, u/Blackvault, started putting in FOIA requests when he was 15 and never stopped. Currently has what is arguably the largest privately owned collection of declassified information from the US government anywhere, and the entire archive is accessible for free. Not a direct answer to your question, but anything you want to know about stuff the US government was up to can be found buried in there, and he's taken the time to sort some of the more interesting stuff out to make browsing easier. His Black Vault podcast is always a good listen, even if you don't buy into the UFO stuff. He doesn't hesitate to point out the bullshit from anyone, whether they are believers in this stuff or not, and gives a lot of time to skeptics to put their side of the argument, and treats everyone with respect. Here's one from the Brits and the Aussies in the 50s. Nuclear tests in Maralinga. Oh yeah, some aboriginals lived nearby. The government were going to nuke Scotland for a while I think. Then they realized that was a stupid idea as Scotland is a pretty small place relatively speaking, and nuked Australia instead. I'm kind of surprised they didn't do as the Americans and nuke a territory in the Pacific. The Pitcairn Islands are still British, and they didn't care about protecting endangered species then. Australia was independent in the '50s. I can't imagine the High Commissioner asking if we could nuke part of Australia. Let's see who's gonna be the soon to be disappeared Redditor who names a currently classified top secret program. Boeing X-37B unmanned space shuttle. It just spent 720 days in space doing God knows what. Testing stuff. And maybe taking pictures like the one Trump tweeted of the Iranian space launch site. Edit. Apparently the USAF has disclosed that it's testing a heat pipe assembly, but I'm sure there's other stuff we're not allowed to know about. The Trump tweet was from the last war version of the KH-11 spy satellites. Scott Manley on YouTube has a solid video breaking it down. In East Germany, a committed freedom fighter and her husband had dealt with having her home raided while she was away, being arrested on the way to protests and all sorts of state-sponsored harassment. After the wall fell, she was able to read the documents the Stasi had kept on her and found out her own husband was an undercover agent and had written many reports on her activities with a bloodless banality. British Metropolitan Police Services have done exactly the same on ecological protesters from organizations like Greenpeace. There was literally a case a few years back, like 5 years ago, an undercover cop I believe married and even had kids with a protester he was investigating the whole way through. And then he didn't have to pay child support costs, he was on the job, and our government said they weren't liable either. Fucking joke. Canadian here. The Somalia affair, not sure if it was ever classified, but definitely a horrific scandal. A now disbanded division of the Canadian military torturing a kid to death in the 90s and taking hero pics with him while doing it. I think it's important to remember, when your country does something shitty, it's not always the bad guys who can be fucking evil. Operation Northwoods, a plan for a false flag operation that came from the Joint Chiefs of Staff and Department of Defense in 1962 and given to JFK, who turned it down. The plan called for the CIA to commit terrorist actions against US civilians across the United States and frame Cuba, allowing us the right to invade and depose Castro and the communist government there. It was declassified and can be found online at the JFK Library. Terrifying that no one knows or seems to care that this was suggested by our government to the president. My high school English teacher mandated that I read this. I didn't understand it at the time, but he was responding to my question I posed him. As an airborne vet, why do you seem so jaded in regards to US history and politics? Still one of my favorite teachers to this day. He and I were able to go into a lot other ost things the US has done. I grew up 2 miles from the Lake Ontario Ordnance Works site, and my dad grew up on 89th Street in Niagara Falls in the 40s. He says that he remembers sitting on the train tracks as a kid watching the Hooker chemical trucks bringing 55-gallon drums to the Love Canal. That whole area was contaminated with all sorts of nasty stuff. So what did they do? They bulldozed it over and built houses on it, of course. Then in the 70s, when people were noticing toxic sludge in their basements, kids' feet were being literally burned by the high levels of phosphorus in the ground, and people were getting sick, they acted like they knew nothing. Eventually people sued, and the whole area was evacuated. They tried to clean it up, but they basically put tons of dirt and clay over the area as a cap, and it's all fenced off. You can see it when you drive east on the Niagara Falls Expressway to Towanda. For the Lewiston storage site, also known as the NFSS Niagara Falls storage site, I've read documents where they had hazardous storage barrels sitting exposed to the element, with seepage and all that. Again, they've covered everything with clay to stop it, but it's already in the ground. The bad thing is that there's a large elementary and high school, Lewiston Porter, about 2 miles from the site, which is actually on property that used to be part of the site, but was never used, and was sold to the county. Needless to say, the cancer rate among long-term staff and teachers is higher than average. I'm glad to have finally moved away. Project Sunshine, where the US government bought remains of dead infants to test for radiation. When they took limbs from them, the parents were never told. One mother wasn't allowed to dress her daughter for her funeral because doctors had removed her legs and didn't want her to find out. So I research Cold War science, notably nuclear weapons, for a living. So it's hard to find documents that make me a little sick to my stomach. The absolute worst though are the ones in which US generals ran through nuclear war plans and their consequences. Here are a bunch of serious patriotic hard-working people, all of whom believe in the ideals of the country and all that, and they're having conversations about killing of hundreds of millions of people, nearly all of them civilians, because they believed that this was the only way to keep the same thing from happening to American civilians. Every once in a while there is someone who says, in essence, what the fuck are we doing? It's rare, but it happened. And that is both kind of refreshing and kind of terrible in its own light. Like, if they never asked that, it'd be creepy, but you'd be able to say, well, they really just never saw it as a problem. But the fact that every once in a while someone says something like, this sounds like the Wannsee Conference, the meeting at which the Nazis hashed out the final solution of the Jews, makes it clear that these people, somewhere deep inside, know this isn't really the way that decent people ought to be acting. can't remember the source, but apparently there is a legit order signed by Hitler to his nuclear researchers saying, if they have a viable nuclear explosive, start loading into V2s immediately. However, Germans didn't come that close to making a nuclear bomb. They didn't consider it a priority because they calculated that it wouldn't be a decisive weapon to win the war, especially against US, who would already have nuclear bombs in their arsenal. Estimates put the probable year for a German nuke, if the efforts continued, around 1947. Fun fact, the Nuclear Research Institute in Berlin was one of the main objectives of the Red Army during the Battle of Berlin. Stalin really wanted to get there before the Americans.